This video will discuss the accidents at 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima, with most of the time spent on 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island occurred in 1979. That was my first year of teaching, and I happened to be teaching 20 miles away from 3 Mile Island. So I have some personal interest there, and let's see if we can discover what happened and talk about the other incidents as well. So just a reminder on nuclear power plants, they're generating energy from fission of uranium in the core. There's moderator material that slows down the extra neutrons released from the fission, so they can encourage fissions to happen in other nuclei here, uranium-235 or plutonium nuclei. There are control rods that absorb neutrons to limit the future number of fissions. They can't completely stop the fissions. We can't put control rods between every atom of uranium. The containment vessel here is a large steel vessel, very thick steel, and there's piping. There's much more plumbing than is shown in this diagram, but the plumbing of the primary coolant loop that removes energy from the core delivers it to the heat exchanger, so steam can be generated in the secondary cooling loop, and the steam then drives the turbines. After the steam passes through the turbines, the water is formed again, the steam is condensed to water, and that can be pumped back through the heat exchanger. 3 Mile Island on the Susquehanna River, south central Pennsylvania. 2 nuclear reactors at this time were on the island. So this doesn't give all the details, but just some of the major events of what happened on the in the accident. March 28th, early in the morning, about 4 a.m., 1979. There had been maintenance done, regular maintenance, scheduled maintenance to clean mineral filters on the in the plumbing. You don't want minerals to collect and clog up the valves and so forth. But air got into the secondary coolant loop. And when those air bubbles pass through the pumps, it would cause the pumps to vibrate. And we don't want pumps to vibrate. The pump housing can be destroyed in that situation. So the pumps were off. The vibration caused them to turn off. And automatically control rods were put into the core, fully down into the core. However, because the control rods, this neutron-absorbing material, can't get between all of the uranium atoms, the reactor still generates a lot of energy, 6% of full power, and it still needs to be cooled. A second problem, the pumps of the spare pumps, there's a lot of redundancy built into the system. The spare pumps have been tested. During the testing, valves are turned on and off, and unfortunately, valves were left in the off state for the spare pumps. So the secondary cooling loop lacked the ability to push water through the heat exchanger. The operators of the nuclear power plant were unaware of this problem for 8 minutes. There are big tags. When something's inspected, it was written on a tag and then left on the control panel, and some of those tags covered up key indicator lights that showed that the valves were closed. So without removing energy from the primary coolant loop for 8 minutes, what happens to the temperature in the primary coolant loop? It does go up. And as temperature goes up, pressure goes up. Well, in the primary loop, there's a relief valve that's built in to and designed to open up if the pressure gets too high, because you don't want your plumbing to break, for pipes to be split and ruptured. So you allow the primary coolant loop to be open for a while. You lose some water. That's designed in. However, this valve failed to close when the pressure dropped down. And this design flaw had happened in another nuclear plant years earlier, but it was not communicated to the operators, or they forgot, I'm not sure which, but not communicated to the operators at 3 Mile Island. So they didn't realize that this valve was open, the indicator light was not near where they were working, so they didn't realize this safety relief valve was open, and it's estimated 1 million or more gallons of water came out of the primary loop. These are big plumbing projects, and we're losing a lot of water here, 1 million gallons, very hot water, steam bubbles inside it, and it's leaking out into the containment building. A new shift of control room operators did come on and close that valve manually. Another problem during the incident is that the safety systems automatically turned on coolant pumps with emergency coolant water. That would have stopped the accident, much less damaging if we could have, if that extra coolant water could have been in place. But the operators looked at one indicator that showed there was still water in the primary loop, at the top of the primary loop. What they didn't realize was the sensor was being caused to be wet because water was splashing in bursts up through the sensor region. So it wasn't continuous solid water, I shouldn't say solid, but filled water in the loop, but there were bubbles and water flying by on the way out the pressure relief valve. So we did not have the cooling necessary. The primary coolant loop lacked the water to completely cover the core of the reactor, and the core partially melted. Did not completely melt, but partially melted. The accident started to get somewhat in control. As I said, the new shift of operators around 6 a.m. Realized that this pressure relief valve was open, so they closed that. If they would have been changing shift an hour later, the accident could have been much more serious. There might have been a full meltdown of the core. So this partial meltdown, when we talk about a meltdown, we're talking about the fuel rods melting. The fuel is inside sealed special alloy steel rods, and if the temperature gets too high, that melts. That allows the fragments of the fission, the radioactive isotopes that are fragments of the fission, to get out into the cooling water. The primary loop is not radioactive normally, but the fuel rods were melting, and the fuel pellets that contain uranium and the radioactive isotope waste products of fission, that got out into the cooling water, this 1 million gallons that came out. So highly radioactive water in the containment building, but could have been much worse if the second shift of operators had not been there. This coolant water in the containment building went down to the floor, started making some depth on the floor, and there's a pump on the floor to pump water into an auxiliary building. And that auxiliary building has a tank to receive that water, but too much water came into the auxiliary building. That tank overflowed. That building had filters on it, but that filtering could not stop radioactive isotopes from getting out into the atmosphere. So there was release at the plant site, and its estimates that I read about were the dose to people, the radioactive dose to people, was less than background radiation for a year, about 1/3, and very difficult to identify for sure, but possibly an extra cancer in that region from people who live close by. A colleague of mine just lived 1 mile from the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant. This colleague stayed in his home during the whole accident, had a Geiger counter with him, portable Geiger counter, could bring back soil from his garden to our building to test the radioactivity there. And he found that there was less radioactivity in the soil of his garden than what was deposited there from when atomic bombs used to be tested in the atmosphere, and fallout would come down in the rain into his garden. Big economic consequences. This really put a stop to any new nuclear power plants being approved. There were some that were completed after 3 Mile Island, but a big reduction in enthusiasm for generating electricity from nuclear power, and it cost the utility about $1 billion to clean up and dispose of that radioactive material, put it in a place that is safer. So a few days after the accident, there was concern that the containment building might have an explosion inside it from the high temperatures, dissociating water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then that could recombine in an explosion. Well, President Carter traveled to the area and visited the plant to reassure the public that things were okay. President Carter did have background in nuclear science, so he knew the situation. There still was some concern that he was there when it wasn't fully under control. There were a lot of evacuations in the area when the hydrogen bubble was thought to be about to explode. And when it's recommended that pregnant women and small children might want to evacuate, a lot of other people left the area as well. Dickinson College, where I was teaching, had 2 spring breaks that year. We had the regular week of spring break, and then the college was closed for a week as students went further away from 3 Mile Island. Fortunately, the accident did not get worse, and people could come back to their homes. As I say, a large cleanup process. This radioactive water in the containment building left residue that was radioactive, so that had all to be scrubbed down and fresh water put on here and vacuumed up and eventually sort of concentrated and disposed of the radioactive residue that remains. There's a very, very good video produced by Public Broadcasting and WGBH TV. It's called Meltdown at 3 Mile Island, part of the American Experience series of videos. Highly recommend that you find a copy of that and watch it. So Chernobyl, 1986 in the Ukraine, north of Kiev. This nuclear power plant was going through a maintenance cycle, and an experiment was thought to be done to kind of watch how electricity generation by the turbines would occur after the steam supply from the heat exchanger was cut off. The people that were put in charge of the plant did not have nuclear plant training. They were more the electrical engineers concerned with the turbines. And they decided to turn off a lot of the safety systems so that they could run their experiment and run the nuclear plant on manual control rather than with automatic safety systems. During their manipulation of the plant, the power dropped too low for the experiment to take place. So they wanted to get more power back in place, so they pulled out control rods. They didn't realize there was a neutron absorbing condition in the coolant water. So that made it difficult to restart the full reaction. So they kept pulling out control rods, many more than were pulled out than should have been. As a result, there was more energy produced, but in a very short time. They didn't have time to react. So the coolant boiled. That decreased the absorption of neutrons and caused more fissions to take place in a runaway event. So a real huge power increase occurred. There was a steam explosion. The plumbing was disrupted. The hot fuel rods were melted, so radioactive isotopes are now no longer contained in the fuel rod. They're exposed. There was, again, dissociation of water into hydrogen and oxygen and a hydrogen explosion. Their containment structure was not as secure as the containment structures you see on plants in the United States. Is more of a metal building rather than a concrete structure, and this hydrogen explosion opened up that building to the environment. The design of this particular reactor used graphite, carbon, as a moderator to slow down the neutrons. That's fine, but with the lack of cooling and the hot fuel rods now in contact with the graphite caught fire. And this fire had a plume, hot gases rise, that carried along radioactive isotopes high into the atmosphere. The winds happened to be towards Sweden, and as workers in Sweden walked into their nuclear power plants, they activated the detectors that said, you have too much radiation on your body. And these were workers going into the plant, not workers from the nuclear plant in Sweden coming out. Sweden looked at the wind direction, saw it was from Ukraine, and made a phone call, and the accident was denied for a little while, but finally the Soviet Union realized they couldn't hide it, so admitted that there was this problem at Chernobyl. There was a fire. The local fire fighters worked valiantly to try to put that out. There was a lot of radiation being released, and 31 people died in just a few days from exposure to the radiation. There was a little bit of delay in evacuation, but eventually 135,000 people from a distance of 18 miles away from the plant were evacuated. It's not known exactly how much health effects were present here, but there definitely was an increase in leukemia, in thyroid cancer, and possibly 5,000 extra cancer deaths that would not have occurred without this accident. Some people have a lot higher number, some people have a lower number. It's not an exact science in doing the studies of what the effects were, but many people are convinced there were many extra cancers as a result of this accident. Then Fukushima, more recently in 2011, there was an earthquake off the coast of Japan that put a little pulse of energy into the ocean, and a big wave came to the shoreline, the tsunami. The nuclear plants were designed to shut down after major earthquakes, after the shaking occurs there, so the control rods go in place. But the tsunami disrupted power to the plants that would run coolant pumps. And the nuclear plants were built right along the coastline. There was a seawall in place to prevent waves from coming up to where the plant was, and the emergency diesel generators that would power the cooling systems. But the tsunami was so large that it went over that protective wall and flooded out the diesel generators. The other backup system in place, there were batteries that for many hours could run the coolant pumps, but eventually those batteries ran out of power, and without cooling the core, the reactors overheated. There was melting of the core, and not complete melting perhaps. I don't know if they've really investigated, have seen inside yet. But there was radioactive material being released out of the fuel rods. There was a hydrogen explosion that broke their containment. Radiation leaks into the atmosphere and into the ocean. These power plants are built right along the ocean. In my reading, I did not see anyone identify any firefighters or workers that died as a result of immediate exposure. Again, a large evacuation, 300,000 people in the region near the plant. Not as severe a release as from Chernobyl, but still a very significant release of radiation, and much lower on estimates of future cancer deaths, but some increase in thyroid cancers that will be monitored over for many years to come. And the fuel that did get out of the fuel rods, again, there's concern about the ability to contain this fuel now and prevent it from getting more into the ocean. So there's concrete being poured around these nuclear power plants and monitoring that. So this is still going to be a problem for years to come until workers can go in and remove those fuel rods and put them in a safer place further away from the ocean. So you could keep an ear out for that, but there's no likelihood of another big explosion or further great release of radiation, just a slow release of radioactive isotopes as the containment of these nuclear power plants is degraded. So those are our nuclear accidents, and there have been others, but these are three significant ones. 3 Mile Island, there was human error in maintaining the plant. There was human error in shutting off the emergency cooling. And fortunately, some people did get to the control room, a new shift, and find indicator lights that showed what should be changed about the way the plant was operated, and it could start to get under control. With Chernobyl, people who didn't understand nuclear reactor physics were in charge of the plant and pulled out too many control rods. A big release of energy and the hydrogen explosion that broke out the containment, and a fire of the graphite core. There aren't very many reactors in the United States that have graphite for moderators. Most of ours are the design of 3 Mile Island. So we couldn't have a graphite fire. I should probably also mention that there's no risk of a nuclear bomb type explosion at nuclear power plants. There's not enough concentration, not enough enrichment of the uranium isotopes in the fuel to ever have a nuclear explosion at a nuclear power plant. We can get these high temperature type explosions, steam explosions of high pressure, but not a true nuclear explosion. And then Fukushima, they did not protect their backup systems well enough from large waves from the tsunami. So the diesel generators that would have kept the plant safe would have been able to run the cooling pumps. They got swamped out by ocean water, and without the cooling, temperature goes up, pressure goes up, and bad things happen. So read on your own about these 3 incidents and ask your instructor some questions.